I set the keys down on the granite and breathe as if I'm recalibrating a machine. The metal taps once, decisive, an almost comical little click that sounds more final than anything I've ever said aloud. He doesn't look up from the newspaper. Of course he doesn't. And for a second, I let the silence carry the weight he always assumed his presence would. Then he says it, the sentence that will live in my head like a weathered coin. You wouldn't last a week without me, Mila. He says it with a smile that has been polished by years of being believed. He says it like a diagnosis, like a fact filed under truth in whatever ledger he keeps for his life. The granite is cold under my palm. The silk of my robe itches the back of my neck. His crystal tumbler glints in morning light, the amber of something expensive and meaningless. In the space between his words and the next breath, something unspools inside me. Not anger so much as clarity, an arithmetic of small hidden things adding up into a plan. I walk out. I do not slam a door. I do not shout. I gather a gym bag, my secret suitcase of small practical lies, and the long sweater. The elevator is quiet. I keep my hands in my pockets. The doorman raises an eyebrow at my choice of shoes for the city. I think about the woman he expects me to be and purposefully trip slightly to appear human, messy, unthreatening. On the sidewalk, the wind smells like a distant rainstorm. I do not look back at the building that is still, for all intents and purposes, his. I have a phone with a charging cable tucked in the lining of the bag. I have a dry credit card in a different name, and the smallest thing that always steadied me, an app with a trading streak no one here knows about. I sit in the Ritz lobby because the world needs a neutral witness. The windows look onto a street where pedestrians keep their lives buffered by umbrellas and purposeful steps. I order coffee I don't want and set the phone on the marble tabletop. On the screen, because I am methodical in ways even I would not have admitted months before, there is a recording I had in a moment of private curiosity left running while he met with a partner in his study. It was a foolish thing to do. It was a practical thing to do. It is at this moment the difference between a humiliating private life and a life I can recalibrate. The voice that fills the earbuds is smooth, educated, infuriatingly casual. Marriages are units of capital, he says, as if reciting a fund prospectus. There is a laugh, his, predatory and small. We keep them tidy. We make sure the wives are ornamental, not operational. It keeps the optics clean. He enumerates with a surgeon's detachment clauses and contingencies, explicit amendments to prenups, names of nominal trusts, and a familiar phrase about removing variables. He uses the word trophy as if it were a compliment. My hands do not shake. My vision narrows. This is not a domestic quarrel. This is a ledger. This is policy. The words, born in a room luxuriously far from consequence, are proof. In his study, folded into a leather-bound planner I have always thought beautiful for its uselessness, there is a stack of paper stamped with signatures and dates that do not match the timetable he has shown me. A breath of ink and forgery. A list of names, women who meant different things to different men, filed like inventory. I feel two things at once. The hollow ache of betrayal and a rising, cold arithmetic. The marriage had been transactional. The bank accounts, the titles, the social calendars, they were all parts of a portfolio whose value he managed without me. To him, I was a line item. To myself, I had been a person quietly building a very different thing. Late-night trades born of boredom and a caste for patterns. A small but compound savior tucked away in brokerage accounts he assumed were decorative. The decision is not dramatic. It is a switch. The conversation in the lobby turns into an equation.
Evidence plus counsel plus patience can equal consequences. I put the phone down. I arrange my hair. I call no one yet. I do not need to. I have, beneath the surfaces of a life people misread, the first threads of strategy. If you want to see how I took everything back, stay with me. I am careful with the word revenge because it is coarse and unreliable. I prefer accountability. I am not interested in destruction for the sake of satisfying an old bruise. I want the ledger corrected, not the world raised. The line between the two, I know, is small and warm as the hand of a lawyer I will later trust. That afternoon, I go to the one person I have known in the building whose memory outlived the men who lurk in its boardrooms, Margaret. She has been Richard Whitmore's secretary for 40 years, a factual part of the architecture of an empire that smelled of leather and fresh ink. People think secretaries are invisible. Margaret knows how things live and how they die. She knows where paper crumbs fall. We meet at a small tea room in Chinatown because hotels feel monitored and because Margaret likes the jasmine tea there. She is smaller than she used to be, hair thin and white, hands with the neatness of someone who has spent decades turning pages and folding envelopes. Her cardigan is camel. She looks like someone you could mistake for a harmless nostalgia. She does not ask why. She holds my gaze with the economy of someone who has seen men mistake her for a shadow and lived to read their margins. Without preamble, she slides a packet across the table. It is thinner than it should be and stores shadows in its folds. 10 pages, 30, the number is not the point. There are names, Elena, Caroline, Jennifer, Madison Hayes, crumbs that suggest a pattern. She hums a little when I hand her the keys to my old safe deposit box, the one he thought was decorative. People throw things in boxes and forget they have blood on them, she says. There is no melisma to her voice.
It is precise, as if she were telling time. Margaret is the first ally I recruit. She is the archivist who will teach me how to read the white space between contracts. With her help, I understand that patterns repeat, not out of malice, but out of habit. A partner disappears, a trust is amended, a charity is named with the same list of beneficiaries. She has boxes in her small apartment filled with minutes from board meetings, annotated guest lists, letters tucked with the kind of intimacy that men like Ashton mistake for frivolity. Not frivolity, Margaret corrects me once over tea. Consent, selection, design. I'm tired, she says once, but some of us like to finish things. The way she says things so slowly, so measured, becomes the measure of what follows. Recruiting Margaret is the moment the personal turns institutional. She carries the memory of the organization in her head the way others carry their childhood home. She knows how Richard thinks. She knows the way the ledgers like to be hidden. With an archivist at my side, data becomes possible. The second recruit is a practical creature named Patricia Kim. Patricia has an office on the edge of the legal district with no marble facade and no pretentious artwork. She hires herself out to problems people would rather not have their family name attached to. When I first meet her, she wears a sensible shoe and an expression that suggests litigation is just a long, complicated chess match. She knows corporate law and the way a carpenter knows wood. She understands, with a specificity that comforts me, the difference between a holding company and a shell corporation and why we must only do what is legal and defensible. You want a structure that protects assets and enables whistleblowing without getting you indicted, she says on our first call. It's all paperwork and timing. We set up Phantom Rose Holdings as a legal entity. You put money into it that you can prove is yours. We make the cash flows visible and traceable. That's how you protect yourself when someone comes asking why. She explains things in analogies.
Phantom Rose is a locked cabinet with a transparent face. Anyone can see there's a cabinet and what's in it, but only the right key opens it. There's no glamour in her office, only file folders and a map of places where municipal records live. When she signs the formation documents, the firm name is precise and a little theatrical, Phantom Rose Holdings, but the paperwork is concrete and unromantic. Articles of organization, bank letters, KYC requirements. She's insistent that every dollar placed into Phantom Rose must be traceable, that our movements are defensible, and counsel is present for any step that could be construed as gray. If you want people to believe this isn't a scheme, she says, tapping the table with a pen, we will make it the least scandalous legal thing in the room. Transparency is our armor. Which, in my world, is a pretty armor.
Phantom Rose's first bank account is modest, funded by nothing dramatic, savings from trades I had executed on nights when the world felt like a pattern to be solved. Those trades had always been my private thing, a quiet confidence that compounded while I smiled and attended galas. It is a funny feeling, moving money that was invisible in plain sight. Bank officers ask the questions the law requires. Patricia answers them in the voice of someone who has done this before. The funds land in the right place with receipts and timestamps. We place the first documents in a safety deposit box, a kind of legal cocoon. Margaret watches me with something close to approval, as if she has been waiting to see me wield a pen. There are rules we do not break. We do not intercept phones. We do not hack servers. We do not forge documents to entrap men who have already demonstrated the capacity to forge. These are not the plots of novels. They are the methods of people who prefer paperwork to melodrama. Where the men I have married and observed have used power as a blunt instrument, I intend to use it as a scalpel, precise, careful, dispassionate. Practical moves are surprisingly moral. I put a transfer through that evening after dinner, 3 small wire transfers from an account under a name he wouldn't notice. Patricia watches. Margaret holds a camera phone to make a contemporaneous ledger. Who, when, why. We make a copy, notarize it, and place it where the law can find it if it ever must. That night, alone in a small suite I have rented under an assumed name, I open the recorder again. There are more voice files, conversations that trace a pattern as reliably as a map. His partner, Nathan, uses a phrase he repeats in a way that suggests memes, not thought. Minimize spousal claims, he says, like a mantra. Make them ceremonial. In the margins of the planner, in handwriting that is not his, are initials next to the women's names. Someone has annotated birthdays next to stock options. A spreadsheet I do not yet fully understand lists numbers beside names. Margaret teaches me how to read the column headers, how to see the cadence of cash flows. It is a machine, and now that I can see the parts, it seems less inevitable. We move in small legal increments and watch for reactions. Ashton is not clumsy. He is practiced at appearing oblivious and manifesting control. Men like him mistake small acts of independence for drama. They misread the orders of magnitude that separate them from women like me who have learned to count. Within a week, the first ripple appears. A partner withdraws from an evening event with a benign excuse. Then another cites a scheduling conflict. There are market tremors that, to outsiders, are nothing more than volatility. I understand them. A time-stamped trade she had performed, one of the orphaned trades in the brokerage account, correlates with a dinner where Nathan had bragged about a merger. Small things.
Proof, once you have trained your eyes, is everywhere. Diana arrives at the periphery of our plan like a weather front. She is the wife of Nathan, and like all the women in these stories, she has been told things about patience and beauty and the value of silence. She joins me one evening in a public cafe where cups sweat and no one asks why 2 women are talking. She is raw and articulate in an unpredictable way. She has photos of emails, of billing statements, of a ledger line that demonstrates a marital transfer. She had been collecting in the only way a person who is not in the moneyed corridors of power can, by storing every email, by saving every receipt, by keeping a log. I kept thinking I was missing something, she says. Then I wrote everything down like I was taking inventory, and it all became a pattern. I hand her a notebook the thickness of a thin Bible. I thumb through the pages, names, dates. The handwriting gets angrier by the month. Diana, when she focuses, is businesslike and terrible. She is the second friend I will teach to be methodical. She learns how to redact correspondence for counsel. She meets Patricia without theatrics and signs acknowledgement forms. The work of making women legible to institutions is prosaic, handwriting, scanning, notarizing, but it is also powerful. There are legal avenues we explore because we are stubbornly respectable in our revenge. Patricia lays out the whistleblower path with the clarity of a cartographer. The SEC has mechanisms to take foreign transactions and turn them into investigations when presented with corroborating evidence. The FBI will pick up patterns that suggest fraud or conspiracy. They respect time-stamped trades when paired with corroborating correspondence. We collect phone logs, bank statements, time-stamped trades, and the kinds of notes only people who have curated their lives and their husbands keep. Margaret reminds me often that paperwork is not just proof, it is a storyline a prosecutor can read. I become someone who can sit in a small room and translate emotion into exhibits. I learn which receipts can make a jury place a man in a room at a particular time. I learn, under Patricia's guidance, that public pressure and legal pathways need each other. Evidence alone rarely moves an empire, because empires are adept at obfuscation. You need the kind of quiet and persistent pressure that shows the market the cracks, and you need an institution willing to pry those cracks open. We plan small provocations, not illegalities, not traps. A ledger slipped into the wrong folder, an email forwarded with a note to the firm's compliance office, innocuous, but enough to test reactions. We stage nothing dramatic. We rattle the cabinet to listen for the keys falling. There is a moment, the first of many, that feels like a test. At an estate brunch where I am nominally a guest, I ask a casual question about a foundation grant and watch the flinch in his eyes like measuring a pulse. It is not a scandal yet. It is a calibration of how much he can bear to let be known. I collect the flinch, store it in my memory like an investment. Because I had been underestimated my whole life by men who thought gullibility was a virtue, my weapon has always been invisibility, the willingness to be non-threatening until I became a problem that could not be ignored. I stop being a trophy when I decide to stop being decorative. The process is less dramatic than you imagine. It is ledger work and patience and a small brigade of allies who smell relevance like dogs smell rot. There are nights I cannot sleep. The insomnia is not guilt. It is the rehearsal of logistics, the replay of voices on a recording, and the smell of that first paper. I sit at a small desk in the dim hotel room and make lists. Call Margaret, scan the amendments, get a certified copy of the signature, open Phantom Rose's bank account under counsel supervision, arrange for notarization. Everything in sequence, everything defensible. Margaret, who has become my unlikely conscience, gives me a lecture at one point that I will remember like a prayer. We do not ruin people for the pleasure of ruin, she says. We make things right. We make sure women can be something other than an accessory to someone else's ledger. Her words, both moral and mundane, guide the shape of what follows more than outrage ever could. There is an early misstep, not a crime, but a small human one. I let myself be seen in a place a photograph might catch me with a man who was not my husband purely by accident. It is a tonic for their rumor mill. Ashton answers by turning up his public smile at a charity event, arm around my shoulders in a photograph that will be printed as proof of a contented marriage. The photograph circulates, and everyone sighs in relief for him. I record the photograph, catalog it, and do not let it bother me. A good plan tolerates misperception. The strategy is not about shredding his reputation overnight. It is about building a structure that will withstand his denials. Phantom Rose is not a weapon in the caricature sense. It is a safe harbor and a staging ground. Patricia convinces me to be measured. They will say you are emotional, she tells me. You must be boring. There are other women, smaller or grander, who drift into our orbit. Madison Hayes sends an email at 2 in the morning asking if I will meet. Elena slides a note in a card. Caroline calls once and hangs up. The basic human detail of hurting people reaching out to me, someone who once sat with a robe and a cup of tea and thought herself powerless, becomes a purpose. I realize, not with fanfare but in careful increments, that my least selfish desire is to make the rest of them legible to law. By the end of the first month, Phantom Rose is legally formed. We file the paperwork under Patricia's watchful eye. It is a small moment that feels absurdly significant. A typed signature, an official filing stamp. The name feels theatrical until the day the bank sends an online notification. The account number is a line of digits that will, for months to come, be my quiet defiance. I put money in, with receipts and declarations. I make sure the funds have provenance. I make sure that if men like Ashton look for impropriety, there is no angle. We do not hide. We document. Margaret begins to ferry items, small drives, scanned letters, the sort of inventory that would once have been dismissed as gossip. She slips a lipstick-sized flash drive into my hand once, her hand steady, as if handing me a weapon she has always meant me to have. On it are minutes, meeting memos, names in typewriter fonts, an annotated list of donations with a curious pattern, the same trust used as a funnel, the same trustee name repeated in different years. Some of it is mundane, some of it is the kind of thing prosecutors like because it shows a habit. Patricia insists we do nothing theatrical. She insists on backups, on certified copies, on chain of custody records. If they think you're theatrically lawless, it undermines you, she says. If they think you're boringly methodical, they underestimate you. I like that she uses the word underestimate almost like a taunt. It is in these weeks with legal forms and tea and low-lit hotel rooms that the idea of an empire begins to mean something different to me. It is no longer the height of a skyline or the number stamped on a stock certificate. It becomes institutions that protect, funds that restore, mechanisms that exist not to aggrandize a man, but to compensate and repair. Empire, in my reimagining, becomes a foundation and a registry and a legal name that can be used to do good. Phantom Rose is a hinge. It will later be the spine of another thing, something I have not yet named in public, something warm and practical, aimed at repair rather than spectacle. All documentation is publicly available at the state registry, she says. The man laughs briefly and then does a slow, unspoken math. Our provocations are not engineered to humiliate. They are engineered to show a pattern. See the money? See the memos? See the amendments? See the habit? If we do our job and collect the pieces, email threads, time-stamped trades, witness testimony, then institutions with the legal power to investigate will be given a map. That is the plan, to make going after the men legally unavoidable. What I hadn't felt until those weeks is an odd mix of grief and exhilaration. Grief for a life I had, for the dignity he gaslit me out of, and exhilaration for the sense that I could be useful in an adult way, that I could be a participant and not a prop, that sometimes the best kind of defiance is paperwork and patience. We close the month with a quiet ritual of sorts. Margaret brings over a small, worn binder with the names of women who had once been referenced as the girls in memos. We lay out the files like a communion. The binder is heavy with human afternoons. I touch the edge of it and feel almost pious. It is not a revenge. It is inventory. It is the ledger of wrongs compiled into the possibility of right. And then a new variable arrives in the form of an unremarkable Tuesday. There is a meeting scheduled at his office, and he leaves in the morning with the same air of impenetrability he always has. I go because it is useful to be seen sometimes in the places where you once were invisible. I ask a question in a cocktail conversation about compliance and watch his jaw tighten for a microsecond. Small, telling. He shrugs it off in front of friends. He assumes he still wears me. That evening, I sit at the hotel desk and count things like the person one becomes when one prefers numbers to drama. The trades settled earlier that day match a dinner he had with Nathan. The timestamp aligns with a transfer Margaret's files suggest. It is not proof by itself. It is a thread. We make a plan to pull that thread but not rip anything open. Patricia drafts a letter to be sent to the compliance office of one of the funds. Innocuous, factual, mildly curious. We will not accuse, we will inquire. Sometimes curiosity, the kind that bears a signature, is the cleaver that parts flesh from bone. The letter goes out with no fanfare. It is boring, methodical, the kind of thing that men like Ashton comfortable because it seems ordinary. But in its ordinariness there is an intention to generate a paper trail that cannot be waved away. If they investigate, then they will have ordered steps to take. If they do not, then the public narrative remains unforced. We have chosen institutions to be our engines. We believe in the slow, careful, lawful engine of bureaucracy. The first real escalation, I feel like a pressure change.
It is a small thing, a passing glance from a partner at the country club, a flat email from an assistant, Nathan's partner missing an international flight for a pressing family matter. It is not yet dramatic. It is a tremor under glass. The house of cards, we both know and do not say aloud, begins to show hairline fractures when the men who run it are asked to justify their edges. I sit in a small Brooklyn apartment I have rented for the months I anticipate this taking, minimally furnished, a table, a pot, a spice rack, and I think of how surreal it is that my empire begins in boxes and receipts and a lawyer's office. I boil water for tea and feel something older than all of this, the presence of my mother in my chest. The woman who worked 2 jobs and never let the world tell her she should be small. I call her on a whim to ask if she has the recipe for pumpkin pie. She laughs and gives it to me in the tone of someone who poured years of herself into something and understood the quiet alchemy that turns sugar and oven into comfort. I tell her nothing of the ledger or the flash drive or the name Phantom Rose.
I tell her I miss her and I will come over for Thanksgiving. There are nights in the weeks that follow when the plan feels both fragile and inevitable. I sometimes imagine the empire I will make. Not a palace, but a registry and a fund, a foundation that will help women whose lives had been correlated into asset classes. I imagine an office with a small plaque, Phoenix Foundation, and a receptionist who will not let the world dismiss someone because of the way she looks. The fantasy is practical: grants, legal support, a helpline. The word empire grows teeth that are civic and decent. Before anything dramatic happens, I make a personal change at the registrar's office on a cold day when the wind threatens my hat. I change the name on my passport back to my maiden name, not as a statement of abandonment, but as a reclamation. The clerk asks if I am sure. I am. It feels like signing for the first time on a blank check that is not meant to be cashed on someone else's terms. The month closes with a small procedural victory. A partner at Whitmore & Co. sends a perfunctory email asking whether Phantom Rose has any connection to me. Patricia replies with a statement of independence and a list of publicly recorded filings. The partner tilts his head at the boring public facts. If you ask some people, the very act of abiding by rules looks like guilt. We accept that. We also accept the quiet moral superiority of being boringly correct in a world that admires the dramatic. The tension is in the waiting, an electrical thing. Every time I check my phone, it feels like a risk, because the news cycles will be the court of public law and opinion, and men like Ashton have an entire apparatus for rewriting narratives. My friends ask if I'm scared. I tell them honestly, yes, fear is not a fatalism, it is a precaution. I sleep with a light on. I sign documents with a hand that has learned to steady itself. We are months into this now. Margaret's boxes grow heavier. Diana's notebook is thick. Patricia's files are meticulous. Phantom Rose holds a modest but legitimate account. The pattern of men's behavior is clearer. We are not ready to publish. We are not ready to indict, but we are building a map. We are making institutions listen. On the morning I decide to test the reflex again, a small, innocent inquiry sent to a compliance email, Ashton texts me, casual and small. "Dinner tonight?" it reads. 2 words that are both invitation and measurement. I read the text and do not reply. I could admit my plans to him. I could throw the ledger on the table and let it all explode, but that is not my way. I put the phone face down and step into the day with a calmness I earned not by defiance, but by drafting. The empire I am building is not a single demonstration. It is an infrastructure. It has patience. I do not yet know where the first headline will land or which indictment will set the dominoes. I only know the labor of documents and the slow music of bureaucracy. I know the taste of coffee in the Ritz. I know the feeling of Margaret's small hand handing me a lipstick-sized drive as if it were a key. Outside, the city keeps its rhythm. Inside, in rooms with legal pads and old planners and quiet women, the architecture of consequences is being built. I have a name again, a bank account that is mine and provable, a lawyer who knows how to make institutions move, an archivist with 4 decades of memory, and a circle of other women learning to catalog their own lives. The work is not spectacular. It is patient. It is exact. It is the kind of thing that makes men who have never had to account for themselves uncomfortable because they cannot see the machinery behind it. They were trained to confuse spectacle with power. I am learning to prefer the other kind, the power of systems that outlast moods. One night, as rain taps the window and I sign yet another affidavit, Margaret brings a tall envelope and a small folded piece of paper. "This belonged to a man named Richard once," she says, and slides the paper toward me. It is a printed amendment, stamped and initialed with an obvious forgery I could have missed if Margaret had not pointed at the inconsistent ink. The implications are not yet headline-worthy, but the document sits on my palm like potential. We do not act on it yet. We catalog, we photocopy, we photograph, we notarize, we write down where we found it. The law is a late flowering plant. It needs evidence in the right soil. Across the street, the Whitmore building has a light that goes on late, the shape of a man at a desk. I imagine, sometimes with a cold humor, the way he files men in his head, their utility, their names like numbers. It is a kind of cruelty to see a life as a resource. It was cruel to me.
Now, with a method and a plan, I begin to move pieces into places that make that cruelty visible in forms that cannot be dismissed as mere private cruelty. The stakes increase, quietly and inexorably. People who take patterns for granted become stories on a page. People who have been dismissed become witnesses. The idea of an empire, my empire, is reshaped. It will be a place where women can find legal iteration and financial paths out of being considered relics of someone else's ambition. Patricia recommends we prepare for one of two things. Either the men will react with legal firepower, trying to intimidate and distract, or the institutions will begin to sniff and act. We ready both lines. We have counsel on standby for defensive motions, and for the moment we transition from private accumulation of proof to public referral. On a wet afternoon, as the city blurs into a watercolored smear, I stand at the window of my modest apartment and watch a delivery man wrestle a crate into a truck. There is something medieval about the sight. The crate looks like any crate. Its contents are hidden by plywood. I think of the men who think that wealth confers impermeability. I think of keys on granite counters. I think of a lipstick-sized drive cupped in Margaret's palm. There is work ahead I cannot yet finish. There will be meetings and subpoenas and uncomfortable television interviews and the ugly anatomy of privilege extracted and named. For now, there is paperwork and waiting and the knowledge that I have begun to build something that can outlast their denials. The empire I am creating so far is a ledger and an office, a foundation in embryo, and a careful legal repository of truth. It is, fundamentally, a decision not to be small. It is a choice to translate indignity into institution. It is my secret, small, inevitable plan. Outside, a neighbor's dog barks at the rain, and the city goes on arranging itself. Inside, I return a phone call and hear Margaret humming to herself in the background. She says, without preface, "We need one more hand. There is someone else who remembers the ledger." I make a note. The shape of the next step is made in one sentence. More evidence, more witnesses, more procedure. I fold the paper into my pocket like someone keeping a map and begin to draft the emails that will make an empire of legality, patience, and purpose. Margaret's sentence, "There is someone else who remembers the ledger," felt like a hinge. Her eyes had the mute impatience of someone who knew where the next piece sat, but not yet how to get it out without breaking glass. I made a note on my phone with a finger that would not tremble, and then I did what I had been doing for months. I lined things up in order. The room where we met smelled faintly of old paper and lemon disinfectant. Margaret handed me a manila envelope with the careful tenderness of someone passing on a relic.
Inside were meeting minutes from a board session no one had expected to survive scrutiny. Names, dates, and a phrase repeated so often it read like a business credo. Optimize spousal liabilities. There were signatures I could compare to the forgeries I had already tucked into the archive. The pattern clicked into place the way a bolt finally finds a thread. We added the new pages to the binder and made copies. We notarized everything Patricia told us to notarize. We made certified copies and triple-backed them with metadata. We placed originals in a safety deposit box, and then, because Patricia insisted on redundancy, we put a second drive in a different jurisdiction with counsel's escrow instructions. She used words like chain of custody as if composing music. Every measure mattered. That week, Patricia filed an official whistleblower submission through the SEC's channels. She drafted the cover letter as if it were a field report, concise, factual, and punitive only in its precision. We included a timeline, redacted emails, time-stamped trades that correlated to boardroom dinners, and the audio clip of Ashton's voice where he spoke about marriages as units of capital. The submission asked formally for an investigation. It requested confidential treatment for my identity under the whistleblower protections. The formality of it made my stomach flip. I had spent months learning how to be boring and implacable. Filing that document felt like setting a legal metronome to a tempo that could not be ignored. It took less time than I expected for the wheels to start turning. An early morning call from a number labeled SEC whistleblower intake came while I was boiling water for tea. The woman on the line, Agent Sarah Coleman, had a voice that matched her badge, steady, without affect. She did not congratulate me or apologize. She asked procedural questions: how I found the documents, who else knew, whether I had copies. Her questions were clinical and grounding. They tethered the emotional freight to a process I trusted. Within days, Agent Jennifer Liu from the FBI reached out. The two agencies coordinated. There were official letters, non-disclosure admonitions, and an odd intimacy to the conversations that followed. Agents asking about a dinner plate, a DAS light moment, a signature. They wanted exhibits. We provided them. I remember the first time an agent arrived at Margaret's building. She made tea like a ritual and then set out the binder while we sat rigid with the kind of attention that comes from people who have been given permission to look. Jennifer Liu wore a plain shirt and a face that said she had been trained to find patterns where the world preferred to see noise. She examined Margaret's notes with a reverence of an archivist and a suspicion of a prosecutor. She photographed pages, asked for originals, and then, politely, asked whether there were other witnesses. That phrase, other witnesses, took on the texture of a key unlocking a door. We had planned for this. We were not amateurs. Patricia had rehearsed our answers and insisted we never go alone to any meeting in which we suspected surveillance. Margaret had a list of people who were willing to testify. Diana, whose notebook had the neat, hot anger of someone cataloging an injury, agreed to meet the agents at a neutral location and hand over her copies. Madison Hayes sent a scanned ledger that matched entries Margaret had flagged. Elena slid into the process with a trembling email. Caroline, who had been more reticent, provided a sworn affidavit. Within a month, subpoenas went out. The law, which had sat inert and polite while men moved money around like furniture, suddenly obeyed a different gravity. If you have never watched bureaucracy turn into force, you should know it is not cinematic in the way movies depict it. It is tedious, exacting, slow enough to be cruel, and precise enough to be effective. The subpoenas demanded board minutes, trustee lists, bank transfers, and the name of any trustee who had signature authority. Counsel negotiated the scope. Patricia argued like someone who had been given an instrument and knew which strings to pluck. The first public tremor came as a seizure warrant executed with an efficiency that seemed strangely ordinary. Dawn, black SUVs, a formal knock, reporters on the curb. I watched the footage on my phone as a uniformed man carried a box out of Richard Whitmore's estate like a commodity on display.
For a brief, ridiculous second, I felt that old, small flush. No one had ever imagined me watching their hands collect their own confessions. Then I remembered to be grateful we had not been reckless. The videotape of our legal process felt like an adobe brick of proof stacking to formation. Ashton reacted in a manner I had known he would, performative composure that cracked into erratic phone calls and an argument at a luncheon where his fallibility showed in a tremor of the hand. Nathan's partner, someone who had always had an eye for self-preservation, began to distance himself from potential fallout. Board members called special meetings, PR teams drafted statements that said nothing. We watched as a ring of caution tightened. Men in the Whitmore orbit began to sift through reputations like miners panning for gold. The narrative changed from domestic quarrel to investigation. That shift is the fulcrum of everything. Once a system takes interest, it becomes hard for reputation alone to insulate misdeeds. When the FBI executed a search on a trustee's home, the image that played across noon news made me dizzy. I had anticipated this, planned for it. I had reconstructed the documentary arc in my mind 100 times, and still the sight of flashbulbs and men with badges felt theatrical. The news anchors pronounced things with a cautious fervor of people touching scandal.
Ashton called 3 times in one day, leaving a message that was equal parts pleading and petulant. I did not return the calls. There is a decency to non-engagement in the face of crisis. It preserves the path you have chosen. Richard Whitmore's arrest was, in the eyes of the public, the peak. For me, it was a necessary but smaller beat in a larger sequence. He was older than the public expected, less a colossus than a tired administrator of his own myths. He was led out in handcuffs, his face more perplexed than enraged, as if novelty had finally caught up to him. There were charges, financial impropriety, conspiracy, and obstruction filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. The SEC voiced contempt through press releases, and the network of trustees and shell entities that had buffered behavior for decades began to rattle. There were hearings and sealed motions. There were men publicly insisting on their innocence while quietly agreeing to talk to investigators in exchange for leniency. Prosecutors are, in the end, practical people. They prioritize cases they can prove. We had given them the kind of evidence they prefer: documentation that traced funds like breadcrumbs, time-stamped trades that matched private dinners, and a recording that captured a philosophy: marriages are units of capital, stated plainly in a man's own voice. That recording was not a dramatic reveal in a courtroom at first. It was an exhibit filed as part of a broader affidavit, and it carried procedural weight because Patricia had authenticated it properly, and the chain of custody for the physical recorder had been established. Margaret's habit of annotating who touched what in her own meticulous hand saved us from the narrative trap of he said, she said. I do not like the word schadenfreude. It smells like something brittle. But there are moments, rare and small, when justice feels like a well-made dish. Watching the first press release that listed indictments against multiple individuals was one of those moments. The headlines were sober and enumerate at once, the way the law can be. For me, it was less about watching fall and more about watching system respond. That distinction mattered. I had not set out to see human beings humiliated. I had set out to ensure accountability. As the criminal cases proceeded, civil counsel filed for divorce. There is something oddly clerical about a divorce proceeding after months of theatric public scandal. The court's language is neutral, almost comforting in its lack of pity. The settlement negotiations were mediated by Patricia, and on his side a counsel who had not expected bargaining to be a thing he would do. We made choices about public statements, custody of a trust, and the realignment of titles. I was represented, and I represented myself in ways that surprised me. I was not the person who would accept a perfunctory settlement to preserve an illusion. I wanted legal certainty,
not symbolic gestures.
There are particulars I'm not at liberty to detail. Some things remain in sealed court filings, others are matters of privacy for people who did not ask for public drama. When specifics are uncertain, I will only say this. The divorce decree dissolved the marriage and redistributed assets in a manner that recognized both my financial contributions, small as they had been in the beginning, and the systemic efforts to mask the nature of the trusts. Patricia negotiated a settlement that included an allotment from disputed funds and secured rights for me to pursue a whistleblower award, which Patricia structured to pass through Phantom Rose for reasons that were legal and strategic. There were tax implications and counsel's fees and that peculiar sensation of a ledger rebalanced. I signed my maiden name back onto documents in court with a kind of gentle triumph. It read on the decree like someone had closed a parenthesis that had been open for too long. The clerk looked at me with professional civility and handed me copies. I folded one into my bag and felt like someone who had completed a course she had given herself. The criminal trials unfolded on a different stage. Margaret testified, her voice small but exact. She spoke about minutes and guest lists and the habit of misdirection that had allowed men in power to think their private economies could go unobserved. Her testimony was not melodramatic. It was devastating because it was thorough. The prosecutor played the recording in open court. Ashton's voice, perfectly ordinary, exerting a philosophy, and the room held the particular electric shock of hearing an ideology exposed. Ashton, who had spent years performing indifference, broke in a way that felt to me almost human, a flush of anger, a few halting words, denial. The jury listened to the evidence with the blank patience the system relies on. Verdicts came down in manners I never took for granted. You must understand, the collapse of a reputation is messy, and they are not always neatly felled like colossi. There were plea bargains, and there were convictions, and there were some who walked away with fines, their names whispered in business columns, their social calendars slightly altered. The outcomes were not theatrical, they were precise. Some men pleaded guilty to conspiracy and agreed to cooperate. Some men maintained innocence and faced the penalty. The law did what the law does. It adjudicated, not avenged. After the courtroom dust settled, I sat with the consequences. There was a settlement, yes, and a whistleblower notice that, processed through counsel, resulted in an award that fed Phantom Rose. But what I wanted it for was neither spectacle nor accumulation. I had the luxury of imagining a different kind of empire, one that repaired and served rather than celebrated. That is when the Phoenix Foundation took shape in my head, less as an abstracted brand and more as a list of concrete services.
Building the foundation was like building everything else. Paperwork first, ethos second, outreach third. We set up a nonprofit with governance documents that insisted on survivor-led decision-making. Margaret insisted on a board that included women who had navigated similar abuse of power, a pragmatic lawyer who would be watchdog, and a fund manager who could describe yield curves without romance. We set aside part of the whistleblower funds as a seed, enough to pay for legal clinics, emergency grants, counseling services, and a small operations team that could put a receptionist on salary. The first meeting of the Phoenix Foundation was held in a small conference room with fluorescent lights and cheap coffee that somehow tasted like possibility. We went through bylaws and mission statements and a list of service providers. Diana spoke with a bluntness that made the developers in the room uncomfortable. She wanted the foundation to fund forensic accountants to help other women contest opaque trust structures. Margaret wanted a physical archive where minutes could be deposited and preserved. Patricia wanted a pro bono cadre of corporate lawyers who could draft watertight affidavits. I wanted the foundation to be boringly practical: helpline, grants, legal navigation. We opened with a pilot program, 3 grants to women who had lost access to funds because of manipulative trusts, a hotline staffed during business hours, and a partnership with a university clinic where law students could assist in compiling evidentiary records under supervision. The first woman who called the hotline was a woman named Aisha, whose story echoed patterns we had seen, but who had the terrifying specificity of a single life. She could not have known the extent of our resources. She called because the number was on a flyer Diana had left at a community center. We offered emergency assistance, legal referral, and a sense that paper could be translated into protection. The foundation grew slowly because I wanted it to grow in the way you build a durable bridge, with engineers, inspections, and conservative load assumptions. I hired a small staff, a program director who knew NGOs, a counselor with trauma experience, and an operations manager with a gift for numbers. We rented an office in a modest building with a small plaque that read Phoenix Foundation and felt ridiculous and right every time I passed it. There were small moments toward normalcy that felt almost sacramental. I invited my mother for Thanksgiving. The apartment smelled like butter and cinnamon and nostalgia. Mom ate the pumpkin pie and asked in the plainest way how I was. I told her that I was tired and that I had learned that the work we did could be useful. She did not ask for details. She had a surgeon's understanding about things that mattered. She said, "You always knew how to cook, honey. You just had to have the sense to keep the oven on." We laughed and did not talk about indictments or settlements. We spoke about pies and about small domestic things that felt like anchors. The foundation's public launch was unglamorous and deliberate. We had a website with a hotline number, and about page that highlighted our legal services, and a calendar of events for clinics. Margaret insisted on an archive section where people could deposit board minutes, guest lists, and other documents for safekeeping. We partnered with a civic newsroom to create a data repository for journalists investigating financial entanglement, because the intersection of public interest journalism and legal process was, in our experience, efficient. That partnership made people in the Whitmore orbit uncomfortable in a way subpoenas did not. Newsrooms have a habit of making reputations inconvenient. As the foundation gained traction, I found myself walking into a room and not being cataloged as an accessory. People listened to me because we had created a resource that did what we said it would. It was strange and clarifying to be given room because you had built machinery others could stand on. I began to speak at panels. I started to teach a class at a law school clinic on how to assemble civil evidence for whistleblower submissions. My voice, which had once been trained to be non-threatening, learned to carry authority that was earned rather than invented. There were personal cracks to men, too. Ashton, for all his bravado, became someone I encountered at depositions and briefly in mediated negotiations. He represented a polite collapse. The kind of man who had always been afforded excuses now had fewer people willing to make them. In depositions, his posture hardened, and sometimes he sputtered with the mixture of regret and entitlement that marks those who have had unearned insulation for decades. I watched him and felt neither triumph nor schadenfreude. I felt a kind of exhaustion and relief. The man who had once reduced my name to an ornament now occupied a clause in a legal document that had no power to touch my future. There were nights when I doubted all of it. The foundation's budget occasionally looked small against the scale of the problem we wanted to address. Some donors were cautious. There were women who found the legal process re-traumatizing and withdrew. We had to learn how to care for people in ways that did not require them to retell their harm on demand. We adapted. We created options for anonymous assistance, for document reviews without in-person interviews, and for grants that could be applied for through an intermediary. When the first woman received a grant and called to tell us she had found a small apartment for her children, the line filled with halting gratitude and snotty tears. That sound, practical hope, was worth every late-night spreadsheet. The public's appetite for scandal cooled as it always does. Life returned to a rhythm that allowed for ordinary cruelty. But in the spaces we had occupied, legal standards had shifted. A trustee's signature now carried more scrutiny. A firm's compliance office took more seriously the inquiries that previously had been filed away. The change was not pious, it was incremental. We did not alter a system overnight, we nudged it. It is a modest thing to nudge the world in the direction of better paperwork and more protective law, but it is also a thing that matters in the long arc. There were gestures of reconciliation that surprised me. After the trials, a former board member wrote a long letter, apologetic and specific, asking if the foundation could fund an independent audit into certain grant decisions. I accepted. The audit revealed more structural problems in philanthropic accounting than I had thought possible. We reoriented some grant practices to avoid the very conflicts that had allowed abuse to fester. Small institutional changes can be the most durable. One of the last legal formalities was the release of the Whistleblower Award. The process took months and a form of paperwork that left little to the imagination. There were publicity snafus we did not need and privacy measures we insisted on. Patricia counseled patience. When the funds cleared, we moved the seed money into the foundation's endowment and set aside an operating reserve. We hired an honest accountant. The ledger, which had once been something that had terrified me when it belonged to others, became a document I could sign without flinching. The image that has followed me, the one that began this whole thing when I set keys on granite and walked away, returned in a new key. I stood in the small kitchen of the foundation's office one morning, alone, and set a different set of keys on the counter. One for the office, one for a file cabinet, one to a safe we used for original documentation. The keys clicked and sounded less like separation and more like a different sort of opening. The granite had been replaced by laminate, and the glory of the moment was quieter and, to me, truer. There was a day the board invited Margaret to speak at a small ceremony where we dedicated the archive room in her honor. She took off her cardigan and sat under a fluorescent lamp looking at a group of people who had been recruited by a habit of attention rather than by glossy promises. She spoke about the devotion of documentation and said more plainly than I had heard before, "We did not make the men worse, we made the system clearer." The room laughed, which is another way of saying we acknowledged it was an odd kind of victory. My mother came once to the office. She sat in the reception area and read a brochure we had had printed in 3 languages. She asked me about grant applications and whether we had a phone that could be answered in the evenings. "You know how to keep a place running," she told me, which was her way of saying she believed I had the grit for it. We went back to my Brooklyn apartment and roasted squash. She told me about the woman she had worked with who had kept a ledger of tips and how, in her later years, she came to appreciate how little details become the substance of things. There is a lineage here, women who keep records, who resist erasure, who make institutions minorly less cruel. I did not become invulnerable. There are nights I still wake with the taste of adrenaline, the same one I felt on long waits for subpoenas to land. Sometimes the foundation receives inquiries from men who want to make a donation and use it for PR. We have a robust screening policy for that. Sometimes a woman calls and we cannot help her because of jurisdictional constraints or because the legal apparatus in her country is weaker than ours. We do not pretend to be omnipotent. The work is often triage and patience. But the work is also a continuity that was for me the most radical survival choice, taking the indignity that the world assumed would define me and turning it into a resource for others. There was, toward the end of the second year, an unremarkable news column that plopped into the public sphere and described changes in corporate giving and compliance that economists credited in small part to the Whitmore inquiry, which was both amusing and correct. We did not set out to change tax law. We set out to make a place for women who had been excused and catalogued. The column quoted me briefly and awkwardly. I remember the reporter's pen scratching and my breathing leveling itself. The phrase that day that seemed to sum everything up was mundane. "The aftermath is often local," she wrote. "It reroutes money and attention back to people who have been left standing in the corners." I used the phrase "my empire" only half ironically in a speech once, because people love a good arc. The cameras captured me and the room clapped. I thought about the word empire and refused its more imperial connotations. The empire I had built, in the end, was administrative, a registry, an endowment, a hotline, legal clinics, and a set of relationships that made institutions slightly less hospitable to cynical manipulation. It was not about dominating, it was about creating architecture. It was about ensuring that if someone woke up one day and decided another marriage would be a transaction, there would be a public roadmap for the people who would be hurt. There was, toward the end of all this, a quieter vindication that had nothing to do with rhetoric. I was walking in a park near my apartment with a coffee, and I came upon a small group of women, 2 laughing, 1 feeding a dog, who stopped and thanked me for a workshop I had given at a community center. They had used our templates to challenge an executor and had recovered a small sum that would allow a woman to pay for dental work. The gratitude in their eyes was ordinary and present in a way that felt permanent.
That sort of exchange is what the foundation was for. It is what empire should be. Not monuments, but mechanisms. As to Ashton, he married the idea of his own resilience for a long time and then adjusted to an existence without the sort of insulation he had once enjoyed. He remarried, briefly, and then quietly retreated into the network of men who write op-eds about resilience and write checks to causes that have nothing to do with restitution. He is a smaller figure in my life now than he ever was in public print. When I hear his name in the news, it is as a cautionary footnote. Once, in a deposition room, he looked at me and said, with the kind of sincerity that arrives late, "I never thought you would do all this." I nodded. That answer felt inadequate. I did not tell him that what he had mistaken for fragility had been, in truth, a quiet apprenticeship. I did not tell him I had been learning to read ledger lines for years. I did not tell him that the thing he had called a hobby, my small late-night trading, had been less about money than about training my eyes to see patterns. I had other things to do than educate him on the contours of my survival. In the 3rd year, the Phoenix Foundation had an office that smelled like coffee and paper, a board that was diverse in ways that mattered, and the beginnings of a fellowship program for young attorneys who wanted to work on financial abuse. We sponsored a documentary that told in broad strokes the stories of women who had been forced to translate their lives into evidence. We funded a research paper that looked at the ways trustees had been used to occlude responsibility.
Our grant budget grew because donors who cared about systemic change appreciated the foundation's modest, measurable outcomes. People sometimes ask whether I feel richer now. The answer is complicated. I have money that is legally mine and not tethered to another man's whim. I have a name again. I have a life that includes ordinary domestic routines, groceries, pot roasts, neighborhood bookstores, and that ordinariness is for me a kind of wealth. The empire I created pays for legal help for women who would otherwise be ignored. It pays therapists for someone who needs to hear, without judgment, that they deserve stability. It is not an empire of palaces. It is an empire of services, of records, of infrastructure. The final step, the one that made the whole cycle feel like completion instead of a revenge novel, was simple. We opened an intake clinic in a neighborhood block that had been ignored for years. There, on a quiet Tuesday, a woman named Rosa walked in with a stack of papers so messy they looked like a small life. She had been told to accept a trust as final. We sat with her for 2 hours, made copies, and placed the originals in our vault. At the end of the session, I walked her to the subway and she hugged me, clumsy and hard, and whispered, "Thank you."
It was a small thing, and the sort of thing that makes policy matter. I keep the original binder Margaret gave me in a locked file at the foundation. Sometimes, late at night, I open it and trace the margin notes like a ritual. I am not sentimental about the past. I use it the way an engineer uses a blueprint. The men who had thought of their wives as ornaments were, in the end, undone by their own need to optimize. They had turned human lives into balance sheets and then been surprised when those balance sheets were audited. There is, in the end, a neatness to the image that began this: keys on granite. I visit my small Brooklyn apartment on a weekday morning and set the keys down. Only this time, the keys include, in addition to a small house key and the foundation office key, a small silver key to a mailbox where we keep copies of petitions and grant forms. The keys click in a sound I have come to like. They are not an ending, they are a tool. I have learned to be careful with triumph. It is not a destination as much as a state in which one can make decisions without fear of being erased. I have learned that agency is a practice, not a final diagnosis. I have built structures that can outlast moods and men. I have found allies in Margaret and Patricia and Diana, women who are not props but collaborators. I have used the law not as a cudgel, but as an instrument of remedy. And when I wake up some mornings and make coffee in a kitchen that is mine, I sometimes say, quietly, "See what we did?" If you know someone who needs help, or if this story moves you, consider supporting organizations that assist survivors of financial and domestic manipulation. There are ways to give that create infrastructure, not headlines. He thought I couldn't thrive. See me create my own empire.